What if the greatest civilizations of Arabia didn't disappear, but were never fully understood? Across deserts we call empty, stone still remembers hands, rituals, and lives that history cannot neatly explain. What remains is not proof, but questions, etched into rock, buried beneath sand, and waiting to be seen again. Beneath the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula lie ancient monumental landscapes so vast and precise that every explanation raises new questions. In Al-Ula and Madain Saleh, entire cliff faces were carved with remarkable accuracy, yet their builders left few clear records behind. Across Harrat Khaybar, thousands of stone structures stretch across volcanic plains in patterns too deliberate to be random. At Tayma, royal inscriptions appear without the large cities expected to support them, while in Dumat al-Jandal and Al-Faw, archaeological layers challenge established timelines. Meanwhile, the rock art of Jubbah depicts animals and scenes from climates far wetter than today, hinting at cultures we still struggle to place. Together, these sites raise a single question: who shaped these deserts, and what forgotten story once linked them all? Al-Nasla Rock. Across the world, remarkable rock formations capture attention through their unusual forms, and in nearly all cases, geology provides clear explanations rooted in erosion, tectonics, and long-term environmental processes. Al-Nasla Rock, often called the Split Rock, stands within this tradition, though its striking appearance has made it one of the most visually compelling natural landmarks in northern Saudi Arabia. Located in the Tayma oasis of the Tabuk region, Al-Nasla is widely regarded as one of the country's most distinctive geological features, not because it defies natural explanation, but because it displays geological processes with exceptional clarity. The rock earns its popular name from a near-vertical fissure that divides it into two massive halves with remarkable straightness. The narrow, clean separation immediately draws attention, giving the impression of deliberate precision. However, geological studies indicate that the split follows a natural joint or fracture line within the sandstone, later accentuated by wind erosion, thermal expansion, and water infiltration over immense spans of time. Such fractures are not uncommon in sedimentary formations, though rarely are they exposed so dramatically. Al-Nasla stands apart from the surrounding sandstone outcrops as an isolated formation, detached from the parent rock mass by erosion. In desert landscapes, such features are often known as pedestal or mushroom rocks, shaped as softer lower layers erode faster than harder upper strata. In this case, both halves rest on narrow stone bases, creating the illusion that they are delicately balanced above the ground. The surrounding mountain range eventually took its name from the rock itself, reflecting its prominence within the local landscape rather than the reverse. The formation rises approximately 6 meters in height, stretches close to 9 meters in length, and measures about 2 meters in thickness. Composed of thick sandstone layers deposited during the early Paleozoic era, likely over 450 million years ago, it reflects a period when the region lay beneath shallow seas. The fissure separating the two halves formed long after deposition, likely along natural stress lines within the rock, and was gradually widened and refined through erosion. Importantly, the split predates the human presence evidenced on the rock's surface. This is demonstrated by the rock art engraved on each side of the fissure, which does not continue across the gap. These carvings, depicting humans, animals, and symbolic forms, are independent on each face, confirming that the separation already existed before the engravings were made. Archaeologists generally date the petroglyphs to several thousand years ago, most likely within the Bronze Age or earlier Iron Age, rather than the much earlier Paleolithic periods sometimes claimed. The rock art includes representations of ibex, camels, horses, human figures, and hunting scenes, consistent with broader North Arabian rock art traditions. These images likely served as territorial markers, waypoints for travelers, or expressions of social identity in a region that once functioned as a vital crossroads for caravan routes linking southern Arabia with the Levant and Mesopotamia. Tayma itself is well documented as an ancient oasis settlement with deep cultural and commercial significance. One face of Al-Nasla is notably smooth, shaped by consistent wind abrasion, while the opposite side remains more irregular and fractured, offering natural handholds. Despite this asymmetry and the narrowness of their bases, both halves have remained stable, illustrating the balance achieved through slow geological processes rather than artificial intervention. Contrary to some popular claims, Al-Nasla was never unknown until recent times. While international attention increased significantly after tourism promotion in the early 21st century, the formation was long known to local communities and scholars familiar with Tayma's archaeological landscape. Theories suggesting ancient cutting technologies or advanced tools are not supported by geological or archaeological evidence, and the inscriptions present reflect typical carving methods used across the Arabian Peninsula. Today, Al-Nasla rock stands not as an unsolved mystery, but as a compelling example of how natural forces can produce forms that appear deliberate to the modern eye. Its significance lies in the convergence of geology, archaeology, and human perception, where ancient landscapes shaped by wind and time later became canvases for human expression. Together, the split stone and its carvings preserve a layered record of environmental history and cultural memory, offering a quiet reminder that nature often achieves precision without intention, and that meaning is added only later by those who pass through and leave their mark. Al-Ula. In the northwestern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, where plateaus rise in subdued tiers and the wind drifts across the land with an almost ritual patience, Al-Ula reveals itself as a landscape shaped less by deliberate design than by deep time. Its sandstone escarpments bear the softened geometry of terrain inhabited far longer than written memory can record, their surfaces worn not only by erosion but by centuries of human presence layered subtly upon the stone. As morning light brushes the cliffs, faint outlines of ancient pathways and long-abandoned dwellings emerge, hinting at a settlement whose quiet persistence once anchored caravan routes linking distant regions and rival polities. From a distance, the valley appears calm and static, yet closer examination dissolves that impression. Beneath the appearance of simple antiquity lies a depth of continuity that rarely announces itself directly, but becomes visible in the remnants of Bronze Age enclosures, the patterned placement of wells, and the barely perceptible alignment of structures that seem oriented toward celestial positions no longer mirrored in the modern sky. In such a setting, conventional narratives of rise and decline begin to feel incomplete. Archaeological work throughout Al-Ula traces layers of habitation extending back several millennia. Early oases were formed through a delicate balance of groundwater availability, sediment movement, and bedrock channels that guided seasonal floods. These environmental conditions enabled successive communities, from early pastoral groups to the Dadanite and Lyhianite kingdoms, to establish inscriptions, sanctuaries, and monuments whose degrees of weathering now serve as imperfect markers of time. Yet the closer these layers are examined, the more inconsistencies emerge. Radiocarbon dates do not always align neatly with ceramic typologies, and certain monumental features appear to have been modified repeatedly across periods, complicating attempts to define clear moments of origin. The valley's prominent rock outcrops, frequently carved into facades or inscribed with texts, add further complexity. While many carvings can be attributed to historically attested groups, others occupy transitional stylistic zones. Their motifs echo neighboring regions, yet their proportions, carving methods, and tool marks remain distinctly local. This ambiguity raises questions about mobile workshops tied to shifting trade routes, or artisans who adapted older traditions whose sources have since faded from the archaeological record. Across the broader landscape, buried traces of administrative compounds, ritual precincts, and trade-related installations suggest that Al-Ula functioned as a connective hinge between Arabia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. However, the spatial logic of these remains is uneven. Some sectors reflect deliberate planning, while others appear layered atop earlier configurations without fully replacing them, indicating patterns of growth shaped more by negotiation with inherited spaces than by centralized urban design. Geophysical surveys reveal subsurface foundations misaligned with later street systems, as well as terraces built using reworked stone from structures whose original locations remain uncertain. These findings suggest cycles of abandonment and reoccupation that may have occurred more frequently than surviving textual sources indicate. Throughout the surrounding hills of basalt and sandstone, inscriptions in Dadanitic, Thamudic, and related scripts mark fleeting moments of presence, yet rarely provide enough continuity to reconstruct long-term political or demographic shifts. Even so, the density of inscribed material points to a social environment in which marking place carried significance, and where distinctions between political authority, religious expression, and commercial activity may have been fluid. This fluidity is particularly evident in the valley's water systems. Ancient channels carved into bedrock or assembled from carefully placed stone blocks demonstrate an evolving body of hydraulic knowledge maintained across generations. Yet later repairs often imitate earlier construction techniques, blurring the distinction between initial design and subsequent maintenance. In some areas, sediment layers bury early features at depths exceeding what natural deposition alone would suggest, implying episodes of large-scale regrading or flood control that go unmentioned in surviving records. Even the monumental tombs and carved facades that now dominate public attention resist straightforward dating. While their stylistic elements often suggest Nabatean influence, the nature of that influence, whether direct, indirect, or selectively adapted, remains contested, particularly where high-resolution photogrammetry reveals chisel patterns inconsistent with known Nabatean tool assemblages. These discrepancies do not imply anomaly, but rather point toward localized craftsmanship that blended external forms with regional techniques, producing architectural hybrids resistant to precise classification. As excavations expand, smaller finds, beads, botanical remains, and fragments of imported ceramics offer glimpses of trade networks that waxed and waned over time, their fluctuations mirrored in the intermittent appearance of foreign materials. Yet even these clues fail to resolve why certain districts prospered while others declined, or why some construction phases appear abruptly without clear antecedents. Geological studies introduce additional layers of uncertainty, showing that tectonic uplift, shifts in rainfall, and changing dune dynamics periodically reshape the valley, sometimes altering water access in ways that may have influenced settlement stability. Establishing firm correlations, however, remains difficult. Pollen analyses indicate cycles of cultivation and retreat, but these do not always correspond neatly with archaeological horizons. Within this convergence of evidence, Al-Ula emerges as a landscape shaped by both opportunity and constraint. Still, gaps remain where neither artifacts nor sediments fully explain transitions. These absences invite consideration of undocumented local groups or episodes of occupation too brief to leave durable traces. And so Al-Ula continues to exist between clarity and ambiguity, its carved cliffs and deserted streets offering just enough evidence to sketch its long trajectory, yet never enough to resolve every uncertainty. In this way, its earliest origins recede into the terrain itself, leaving behind a restrained sense of wonder that endures as steadily as the stone through which the valley's light continues to move. Harrat Khaybar. Across the dark volcanic expanse of Harrat Khaybar, where basalt flows spread in broad, uneven sheets and ancient cones rise like extinguished beacons against a pale horizon, the landscape initially presents itself as a purely geological domain. Formed through successive eruptions unfolding over hundreds of thousands of years, the lava fields appear at first glance untouched by human intent. Yet scattered among the domes, fissures, and fractured plateaus are countless stone constructions, keyhole-shaped monuments, circular cairns, low-walled alignments, and the long converging arms of so-called desert kites, whose quiet persistence interrupts the illusion of an uninhabited terrain and introduces a human presence layered across millennia of environmental change. At an initial level, these features may appear utilitarian, remnants of pastoral or hunting practices adapted to a harsh volcanic setting. However, as researchers map their distribution with increasing precision, the complexity of the system becomes unmistakable. The structures are not randomly placed. Instead, they follow the contours of the lava field, align with seasonal watercourses, and occupy elevated vantage points overlooking corridors of movement across the basalt. Despite this evident intentionality, their sequence of construction remains difficult to establish. Radiocarbon dates drawn from associated contexts often produce broad ranges that overlap and diverge, resisting the construction of a simple chronological framework. The sheer density of these installations creates an impression of sustained prehistoric activity, though the nature of that activity varies according to structural type. Desert kites, defined by long guiding walls narrowing toward terminal enclosures, suggest coordinated hunting strategies practiced across large areas of northern Arabia. By contrast, the keyhole-shaped monuments, comprising circular stone mounds attached to tapering, sometimes gently curved tails, appear less practical in function. They are widely interpreted as commemorative or symbolic constructions, though their specific meanings remain uncertain due to the scarcity of associated artifacts and human remains. Geological factors further complicate interpretation. The basalt substrate preserves features unevenly, depending on surface weathering and fracture patterns. Some structures appear relatively recent simply because they are better preserved, while others are rendered nearly invisible beneath thin veneers of wind-blown sediment. In areas where later lava flows reworked earlier surfaces, the original extent of ancient installations may be partially or entirely obscured, blurring distinctions between phases of activity. Limited excavation of selected features has yielded sparse but informative materials, including charcoal traces, fragments of animal bone, and occasional lithic artifacts. Yet these findings raise as many questions as they resolve. Some keyhole monuments contain burials, while others do not. Certain desert kites show evidence of repeated use, repair, and modification, whereas others appear to have been abandoned shortly after construction. Such variability suggests a landscape used episodically by different groups whose identities cannot be clearly distinguished through material culture alone. The placement of many structures corresponds closely with subtle environmental cues: breaks in the lava crust, elevated overlooks of grazing areas, and pathways likely used by herds or game animals during seasonal movements. Whether these alignments reflect long-term planning or pragmatic adaptation remains open to interpretation, particularly since ethnographic parallels from later periods offer only partial guidance. As satellite imagery, aerial photography, and drone-based mapping continue to expand the documented inventory of features, researchers encounter configurations whose functions remain debated: circular clusters that may represent temporary camps or ritual spaces, elongated walls lacking terminal enclosures, and geometric forms whose purpose is obscured by erosion or incomplete preservation. None of these ambiguities imply anything extraordinary. Rather, they underscore the inherent difficulty of reconstructing intention within a vast and shifting volcanic environment. Basalt's tendency to fracture along irregular planes introduces further uncertainty, as natural formations can mimic anthropogenic shapes. Distinguishing deliberate construction from coincidental rock arrangements requires cautious ground verification, leading in some cases to revised interpretations of features once thought to represent extensive building programs, but which may instead be natural formations later adapted or emphasized by human use. Environmental research indicates that during certain prehistoric intervals, Harrat Khaybar experienced more favorable rainfall regimes, supporting vegetation and wildlife sufficient to sustain mobile pastoral communities. However, the timing of these climatic phases remains broadly defined, and correlating ecological conditions with construction episodes remains challenging. It is nonetheless likely that at least some monuments were built during periods when the landscape supported more regular movement of animals and people than it does today. On the margins of the lava field, fragments of rock art, simple animal figures, abstract markings, and occasional inscriptions, suggest intermittent cultural interaction with neighboring regions. Yet these elements are too sparse and stylistically varied to form a continuous narrative, and their dating often relies on comparative analysis rather than secure chronological anchors. In several areas, researchers observe that keyhole monuments cluster around earlier cairns, or that desert kites intersect older alignments, hinting at sequences of reuse or reinterpretation whose motivations remain obscure in the absence of associated settlements. The scarcity of domestic debris across the Harrat suggests that the region functioned primarily as a specialized activity zone, perhaps devoted to hunting, seasonal pastoralism, or commemorative practices, rather than as a densely inhabited landscape. Yet the scale and coordination evident in many installations point to collective action that is not easily reconciled with the limited material evidence of everyday life. Occasional anomalies, stone rings lacking clear entrances, detached tail-like features, or long walls leading toward no obvious destination, do not indicate unknown cultures, but rather illustrate how partial preservation, later modification, and geological interference can obscure original design logic. Ultimately, the stone structures of Harrat Khaybar form a broad and understated archive of practical and symbolic activity distributed across a terrain shaped by fire. Each feature offers fragments of insight into how ancient communities engaged with this volcanic landscape, yet none provides a complete account. What remains is a persistent sense of inquiry rooted not in dramatic mystery, but in the quiet complexity of a place where human intention intersected with geological immensity, producing a record as intricate as it is incomplete. Madain Saleh, Al-Hajr. South of Al-Ula, where vast sandstone massifs rise in broad, stepped walls and the desert floor spreads outward as a quiet plain of pale gravel and drifting shadow, Madain Saleh emerges with a stillness that conceals the complexity of its carved architecture. Its facades stand in measured rows, orderly yet restrained, as though suspended in anticipation of a community whose presence now survives only through tools, chisel marks, and architectural decisions rather than voices, texts, or continuous historical accounts. At first encounter, the site presents itself as a recognizable Nabatean counterpart to Petra. Monumental tombs, carved stairways, and carefully proportioned facades follow familiar compositional principles, employing decorative vocabularies that echo those found across the Nabatean world. Yet as one moves among these hewn chambers, that sense of familiarity gradually loosens. Subtle irregularities in orientation and spacing become apparent where cliff faces shift angle and internal fractures within the sandstone dictate what can and cannot be carved. The resulting pattern proves less uniform than it appears from afar, suggesting that the builders continually adapted their intentions to the constraints of the rock rather than imposing rigid designs upon it. This ongoing negotiation is visible in unfinished tombs and abandoned outlines, where attempts at ornamentation were halted when stone proved too friable, too coarse, or structurally unreliable. Inscriptions carved into select facades record names, titles, and burial claims, yet they offer little explanation for why this caravan settlement expanded to such scale at this particular moment, or how its clustered tomb groups relate to the broader ebb and flow of Nabatean political and economic authority across northwestern Arabia. Archaeologists studying the stratigraphy of nearby habitation areas note a striking imbalance. Domestic zones appear unexpectedly sparse when compared to the density and ambition of the monumental funerary architecture. This disparity raises questions about patterns of occupation, suggesting rhythms of life shaped by seasonal presence, transient populations, or administrative functions rather than sustained urban residency. Material evidence provides partial insight. Pottery fragments, metal implements, and imported goods indicate participation in long-distance trade networks extending deep into Arabia and northward toward the Levant. Yet the volume and composition of this material fluctuate unevenly across layers. Some phases show an abundance of foreign wares, while others are dominated by local products, resisting simple chronological alignment and prompting debate over shifting caravan routes, episodic trade intensification, or temporary relocations that left intermittent archaeological traces rather than continuous accumulation. Geological surveys add further nuance. The sandstone formation at Madain Saleh exhibits significant variation in bedding planes even over short distances, meaning that each facade represents a distinct dialogue between artisan and stone. Differences in weathering patterns, particularly around cornices, pilasters, and engaged columns, suggest construction episodes that may have been separated by longer intervals than stylistic similarity alone would imply. Even the most imposing tombs, with their sharply defined pediments and finely carved capitals, do not resolve questions surrounding labor organization. It remains unclear whether specialized master builders moved between sites, whether local workshops developed distinctive carving traditions, or whether recurring chisel signatures reflect groups of artisans whose activities were never recorded in text. Such uncertainties fall well within the expected limits of archaeological interpretation in a region where written archives are scarce. Beyond the main tomb clusters, small quarries and partially worked blocks point to industrial zones that once supplied construction efforts. Yet the distribution of waste flakes does not consistently correspond with nearby monuments, leading some researchers to propose that stone was transported across greater distances than anticipated, or that certain areas were reused during multiple phases whose sequence remains difficult to disentangle. Although Nabatean influence is unmistakable, subtle departures in proportion and decorative detail, such as localized interpretations of crow-step motifs or minor variations in column spacing, indicate that the architectural language here was shaped not only by external models, but also by regional adaptation and practical constraint. This serves as a quiet reminder that cultural transmission rarely produces exact replicas. Beneath the monumental tombs themselves, traces of earlier activity complicate the narrative further. Hearths, storage pits, and post holes point to occupations predating the funerary phase. The relationship between these earlier groups and the later Nabatean builders remains uncertain, particularly as some ceramic traditions appear to break sharply, while others suggest gradual continuity. Environmental research introduces yet another layer of interpretation. Fluctuations in aquifer levels and episodic changes in rainfall likely affected the productivity of nearby agricultural plots, influencing the settlement's prosperity. However, correlations between environmental data and archaeological phases remain imperfect, leaving open the question of causation versus coincidence. As mapping and documentation continue with increasing precision, researchers encounter spatial anomalies. Alignments lacking obvious ritual or practical function, clusters of minor features whose purposes remain debated, and gaps where denser occupation might be expected. These observations do not point to anything extraordinary, but rather underscore the limits imposed by a fragmentary record. And so the carved facades of Madain Saleh, monumental yet restrained, precise yet elusive, stand within the desert not as relics of a lost civilization, but as the layered outcome of well-documented cultures working within the constraints of landscape, climate, and circumstance. They offer clarity in form, yet uncertainty in sequence, leaving a subdued question suspended in the still air about the choices, adaptations, and forgotten moments that shaped a city whose story remains incomplete, despite the remarkable stone record it left behind. Tayma Oasis. In the wide basin of northern Arabia, where shifting sand seas press against low basalt ridges, the oasis of Tayma emerges as a restrained constellation of wells, settlement mounds, and eroded walls. Its subdued presence conceals a long and complex record of human occupation, one that extends far beyond what its weathered outlines initially suggest. At first glance, the ruins appear to represent the accumulated remains of an oasis town shaped primarily by agriculture and trade, its mud brick forms softened by centuries of wind erosion and episodic flooding. Yet as one approaches the vestiges of its fortifications and the tall, solitary Tayma stone bearing its Aramaic inscription, the atmosphere shifts. The site begins to reveal a deeper, layered history in which the oasis functioned not only as a caravan stop, but at various moments as a political refuge, an administrative center, and a point of cultural convergence linking the Levant with Inner Arabia. Archaeological investigations indicate that Tayma's earliest occupation reaches back into the Bronze Age. Stratified deposits beneath later architectural phases document gradual transitions in subsistence strategies, storage systems, and ceramic traditions, forming a sequence considerably older and more intricate than the visible ruins alone imply. These transitions are not always gradual. Certain layers show abrupt shifts in material culture that do not align neatly with known regional disruptions, raising questions about localized demographic changes, climatic variability, or economic realignments that left only partial traces in the archaeological record. The oasis's viability depended on its water system, anchored by deep wells drawing from ancient aquifers. Paleohydrological studies suggest that groundwater levels fluctuated over time, potentially influencing cycles of growth and contraction. Yet correlations between these environmental changes and occupation phases remain imprecise. In some instances, periods of architectural expansion appear to coincide with reduced water availability rather than abundance, pointing toward social adaptation, resource management, or redistribution strategies rather than environmental determinism alone. Among Tayma's most imposing features are the remnants of its massive city wall. Portions still stand in uneven tiers of stone and mud brick, their foundations resting atop earlier fortifications built using different techniques. These variations indicate long-term modification rather than a single, unified construction effort. Subtle deviations in alignment along certain wall segments suggest the incorporation of older structures or shifting settlement priorities as the oasis evolved. Ceramic assemblages recovered from areas near the walls reflect trade connections extending west toward the Mediterranean, south into the Arabian Peninsula, and northeast toward Mesopotamia. However, the presence of imported goods fluctuates unpredictably. Some phases display sustained external contact, while others appear markedly inward-looking, complicating attempts to define Tayma's role within broader commercial networks. The historically documented episode in which the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus resided in Tayma for an extended period adds further interpretive complexity. Although textual sources confirm his presence, the archaeological signature of royal occupation is surprisingly diffuse. No single architectural complex can be securely attributed to his residence, and only a small number of objects datable to his reign offer indirect support. This disparity has prompted scholars to reconsider assumptions about the nature and visibility of imperial authority within an oasis setting. Excavations in residential areas reveal multi-room houses, storage spaces, and workshops arranged in ways that suggest a stable urban community. Yet later rebuilding episodes obscure earlier layouts, making it difficult to trace clear patterns of social organization or long-term development. In certain sectors, collapsed walls left unrepaired point to localized abandonment events that do not fully align with broader patterns of continuity. Small finds, including seal impressions, fragments of plastered floors, and botanical remains, provide glimpses into administrative practices and daily life. Yet these materials often complicate interpretation. Some seals bear imagery associated with distant regions, while others appear locally made yet stylistically unusual. Likewise, the presence of non-native plant species implies trade connections whose precise origins remain uncertain. Geomorphological studies indicate that migrating dune systems periodically encroached upon cultivated zones, potentially influencing irrigation strategies and settlement layout. Synchronizing these episodes with archaeological phases remains difficult, leaving open questions about how frequently the community was forced to reorganize its agricultural footprint. Scattered stone structures, cairns, alignments, and low enclosures add further texture to the landscape. Their functions, ranging from burial markers to boundary indicators or pastoral installations, remain ambiguous due to erosion and the lack of datable materials. Inscriptions found throughout the region, written in Aramaic, Lihyanite, and related scripts, attest to Tayma's linguistic and cultural fluidity. Yet these texts are often formulaic, offering limited insight into broader socio-political dynamics and leaving gaps between the epigraphic and archaeological records. Modern remote sensing has revealed rectilinear shadows beneath the sand, faint outlines of large compounds, and subsurface channels diverging from visible well systems. These findings do not suggest anything extraordinary, but underscore how much of the oasis's infrastructure remains concealed, shaped by natural deposition and centuries of reuse. Even the Tayma stone itself, despite its importance for understanding regional administration and language, stands as an isolated text. Its broader implications are constrained by the scarcity of comparable inscriptions, offering a glimpse into governance without fully illuminating the context in which it was produced. Thus, the ruins of Tayma, expansive yet understated, emerge as a mosaic of partial histories: hydrological, commercial, political, and domestic. Each is preserved with enough clarity to establish its presence, but not enough to resolve its full sequence. What remains is a quiet enigma set within the desert, where water, trade, and shifting cultural boundaries shaped a community whose story survives in fragments and silences, inviting reflection not through dramatic unknowns, but through the subtler uncertainties woven into the long life of an oasis that endured well beyond many of the forces that once defined it. Elephant Rock. East of Al-Ula's Central Valley, where isolated sandstone monoliths rise like solitary witnesses to tens of thousands of passing seasons. Elephant Rock stands apart from its surroundings. Its broad arch and rounded contours were shaped through prolonged wind abrasion and slow cycles of thermal expansion that long predate any human presence. At first glance, it appears to be purely a geological formation, an accidental sculpture of erosion that happens to resemble a familiar form. Yet closer inspection alters that initial impression. Near the base of the monolith, faint incisions and weathered petroglyphs become visible, their shallow lines softened by centuries of sand-laden winds. These markings introduce the first indication that this natural landmark once carried meaning beyond its striking silhouette. The carvings, modest in scale when compared to the monumental facades of Madain Saleh, include animal figures, tribal emblems, and occasional inscriptions whose clarity varies with the condition of the sandstone surface. Few of these marks offer firm chronological anchors. However, stylistic comparison with broader Arabian rock art traditions suggests that multiple groups contributed to the imagery over extended periods. The result is a palimpsest of minor gestures layered upon a landscape shaped not by deliberate design, but by geological time. Surveys conducted around the formation reveal scattered lithic fragments, traces of hearths, and outlines of temporary encampments. These findings suggest that Elephant Rock functioned not as a permanent settlement, but rather as a waypoint or gathering place for people moving through the region's interconnected system of oases and seasonal grazing routes. The uneven distribution of these features raises further questions. The rock may have served as a territorial marker, a ritual focal point, or simply a recognizable landmark within a dune field whose contours shifted gradually over centuries. The petroglyphs themselves complicate interpretation. While some depict familiar motifs, ibex, camels, and simplified human forms, others display stylistic affinities with distant regions. Elongated animal figures resemble examples known from northern Arabia, while certain geometric patterns echo carvings documented near the Jubbah basin. These similarities do not imply direct contact, but rather point to shared visual traditions that evolved across open desert landscapes. Attempts to date the carvings through micro-erosion analysis produce broad chronological ranges that overlap multiple cultural periods, making it difficult to determine whether the marks reflect episodic visits or sustained engagement with the site. The absence of associated architectural remains further limits definitive conclusions. Geological assessments add another layer of complexity. Erosion rates vary across the surface of the formation, meaning some carvings have degraded more rapidly than others. This differential weathering can create misleading impressions of relative age that may instead reflect exposure to prevailing winds, the orientation of bedding planes, or variations in mineral composition within the sandstone layers. Despite these challenges, the cumulative evidence points toward a location that never functioned as a formal artistic center, yet repeatedly attracted attention, likely due to its natural prominence, its position along transit routes, or even the subtle acoustic effects produced by the arch, which can amplify footsteps and voices. Such sensory qualities, however, remain speculative and are noted only in modern observational reports. Additional features introduce further ambiguity. Low stone rings, simple alignments, and scattered cairn-like arrangements appear in the vicinity, though their functions remain unclear. Elsewhere in Arabia, similar features served practical roles such as wayfinding or herd management, while others carried symbolic meanings now inaccessible to interpretation. Without clear stratigraphic context, their significance at Elephant Rock remains unresolved. Environmental reconstructions suggest that during certain periods the surrounding plains supported more vegetation than today, including ephemeral grasslands and scattered shrubs. Such conditions may have drawn pastoral groups whose movements intersected repeatedly with the landmark. Yet these reconstructions offer broad environmental parameters rather than specific historical narratives. While the rock's evocative form invites modern symbolic associations, archaeological caution discourages attributing meaning without supporting evidence. The carvings themselves do not clearly encode mythic or ritual content, instead reflecting the everyday motifs common throughout ancient Arabian visual traditions. Even so, the act of carving into a natural formation that already commanded attention suggests a relationship between people and landscape that extended beyond simple utility. Whether commemorative, territorial, or expressive, the motivations behind these marks remain obscured by time. Scattered ceramic fragments recovered nearby range from early Arabian wares to later Islamic period material, yet their low density reinforces the view that this was a transient nexus rather than a settled community. As documentation continues, researchers encounter anomalies, faint grid-like abrasions near the base that may result from tool sharpening or natural exfoliation, clusters of abstract lines whose orientations diverge from known stylistic norms, and partially buried boulders bearing carvings inconsistent with those on the main formation. None of these suggest extraordinary activity, but together they underscore how fragmentary the archaeological record remains. Excavation is constrained by the fragility of surrounding sediments and the need to preserve the landmark itself. As a result, questions persist regarding the sequence of activity at the site, whether certain carvings correspond to periods of heightened mobility, shifting territorial boundaries, or changes in trade networks linking northern and southern Arabia. Ultimately, Elephant Rock stands as a quiet composite of natural process and human gesture, a form shaped over millions of years, marked intermittently across millennia. Its significance lies not in monumental declarations, but in the subtle traces left by travelers, herders, and small groups who paused briefly to inscribe their presence upon a surface already ancient, leaving behind not a grand enigma, but a restrained uncertainty that endures in the dialogue between enduring stone and the nearly erased intentions of those who marked it. Al-Faw. Deep in the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, where the dunes of the Rub al-Khali gradually loosen into gravel plains and low escarpments, the ancient city of Al-Faw emerges as a wide expanse of foundations, eroded walls, and wind-softened courtyards. At first glance, the site appears to be little more than the remains of a long-abandoned desert settlement. Yet closer examination reveals a community far more carefully organized and socially complex than its subdued surface initially suggests. The city's layout is defined by broad thoroughfares, substantial residential compounds, market areas, temples, and an extensive necropolis. Together, These elements indicate a settlement that once occupied a strategic position along caravan routes linking southern Arabia with central and northern regions. Archaeological investigations show that Al-Faw flourished over several centuries, its prosperity closely tied to long-distance trade and its role as a point of cultural interaction between different parts of the peninsula. Even so, the earliest architectural phases already point to unresolved complexities. Beneath later buildings lie earlier alignments that do not always correspond to the final street grid, suggesting gradual shifts in urban planning, responses to environmental conditions, or successive expansions that reworked earlier neighborhoods rather than replacing them entirely. The temple complex, characterized by thick enclosing walls, plastered floors, and assemblages of ritual objects, offers one of the clearest insights into the city's socio-religious life. Yet these remains raise questions as much as they provide clarity. While some inscriptions and decorative motifs reflect clear connections to South Arabian cultural traditions, others appear distinctly local, producing a blended architectural and artistic language that resists attribution to a single cultural source. This combination points to a religious landscape shaped by both external influence and internal continuity. Residential quarters reveal multi-room stone houses arranged around internal courtyards, some of which contain evidence for workshops, storage facilities, and water installations. The degree of standardization varies considerably across the city. Certain districts appear carefully planned, while others seem to have developed more organically, perhaps reflecting population growth, economic fluctuation, or shifts in social organization over time. Small finds recovered from these areas, including glass fragments, beads, metal tools, imported ceramics, charred seeds, and traces of textile production, suggest an active economy connected to wider trade networks. Yet the uneven distribution of imported goods complicates interpretation, as concentrations do not always align with periods traditionally associated with peak commercial activity, raising questions about episodic trade, storage practices, or socially differentiated access to foreign materials. Environmental reconstructions indicate that Al-Faw once occupied a more hospitable landscape than exists today. A shallow basin appears to have supported vegetation, while wells and water management systems supplied domestic and agricultural needs. However, the timing of climatic changes that reduced water availability remains imprecise, and the relationship between environmental decline and the city's eventual abandonment is therefore suggestive rather than conclusive. Geological studies further show that erosion and shifting dune systems have obscured portions of the settlement. As a result, the visible remains likely represent only part of the original city, with remote sensing revealing rectilinear shadows beneath sand drifts, faint outlines of peripheral structures, and interrupted street patterns indicating a more extensive urban footprint. The necropolis, containing a range of tomb types from simple pit burials to more elaborate stone-built chambers, preserves inscriptions and offerings that illuminate aspects of identity, status, and belief. Yet here, too, ambiguities arise. Some tomb assemblages differ markedly from nearby burials in ceramic style or associated goods, suggesting either long-term variation in funerary practices or the presence of groups whose integration into the community left uneven material traces. Inscriptions found throughout the city, written in ancient South Arabian script associated with the Kingdom of Kinda, provide names, dedications, and administrative references. While invaluable, these texts rarely supply the narrative continuity needed to connect architectural phases with specific historical events. Their uneven distribution, concentrated in certain quarters and absent in others, raises questions about literacy, social hierarchy, and the organization of civic authority. Beneath the settlement, water channels show evidence of repeated repair and modification, with stratigraphic indications of fluctuating flow levels that may have required periodic adjustments in agricultural planning. Yet synchronizing these interventions with broader occupational phases remains difficult, leaving uncertainty about the community's long-term resilience to environmental variability. Among the more enigmatic features of Al-Faw are several large buildings whose functions remain unclear. Structures with thick walls and minimal internal divisions may have served as storage facilities or assembly spaces, but their locations do not consistently correspond with areas identified as administrative centers, and the scarcity of associated artifacts prevents firm conclusions. As researchers continue refining the site's chronology, inconsistencies persist between ceramic typologies, radiocarbon dates, and architectural sequences. These discrepancies do not suggest anything extraordinary, but rather highlight the challenges of reconstructing a long-lived urban landscape shaped by gradual change and episodic reconfiguration. Even the reasons for Al-Faw's eventual decline remain only partially understood. Diminishing water resources, shifts in trade routes, and broader regional transformations likely all played roles, yet the archaeological record points to no single catastrophic rupture. Instead, it preserves signs of gradual contraction, the partial abandonment of districts, and the slow dissolution of the urban fabric beneath encroaching sands. Today, Al-Faw stands as an extensive and intricate yet incomplete record of an Arabian city whose prosperity and adaptability are evident, but whose internal rhythms, cultural interactions, and final retreat into the desert remain only partly illuminated. Its remains invite sustained curiosity not through dramatic mysteries, but through the quieter uncertainties embedded within a settlement that once thrived at the intersection of landscapes, languages, and long-distance exchange. Dumat, al-Jandal. In the far northern reaches of Arabia, where limestone ridges gradually dissolve into gravel plains and steady winds move through narrow corridors shaped by ancient walls, Dumat al-Jandal rises from its stratified tell as a settlement formed by the interplay of oasis life and shifting political frontiers. At first glance, the surviving architecture conveys the image of a fortified town anchored by water resources and long-distance travel routes. The most prominent elements, the imposing fortress of Khazar married with its stepped limestone profile and the nearby mosque traditionally associated with early Islamic phases, create a coherent visual narrative of defense, administration, and religious continuity. Closer examination, however, reveals a depth of occupation that extends well beyond the periods represented by the most visible monuments. Beneath later architectural layers lie traces of Iron Age and earlier habitation, marked by foundations that do not consistently align with the urban layouts imposed by subsequent builders. These misalignments introduce subtle but persistent discontinuities that complicate any linear interpretation of the site's development. Archaeological excavations indicate that the oasis supported human occupation over several millennia, with wells, storage installations, and mud brick walls forming successive layers of domestic and communal activity. The occupational sequence, however, is not entirely coherent. Certain strata display abrupt changes in ceramic traditions and faunal remains that do not neatly correspond with established regional chronologies. Such shifts suggest episodes of demographic change, alterations in trade connections, or periodic reorganization of the settlement whose underlying causes remain difficult to reconstruct. Environmental evidence points to fluctuations in water availability, yet the relationship between these hydrological changes and architectural phases remains elusive. In some instances, periods of apparent construction expansion coincide with drier climatic intervals, implying that local strategies, such as deeper well excavation or more centralized labor management, may have mitigated environmental stress. Khazar Merit itself adds another layer of complexity. Constructed from limestone blocks laid in irregular courses, the fortress reflects multiple building and repair episodes. While certain sections can be reasonably associated with late pre-Islamic and early Islamic phases, other portions exhibit masonry techniques and mortar compositions that may indicate earlier foundations or later restorations. These distinctions are often blurred by erosion, collapse, and stone reuse, which obscure original construction boundaries and merge materials from different periods into a single visible mass. Nearby, the mosque, among the earliest known in northern Arabia, incorporates reused architectural elements, including stones bearing earlier inscriptions. This practice reflects pragmatic construction choices, but also complicates efforts to separate the mosque's architectural history from the broader chronology of the settlement. Beyond the central core, surface surveys and limited excavations reveal additional features: irregular clusters of dwellings, heavily eroded enclosures, and peripheral agricultural installations. Their uneven distribution suggests a settlement that expanded and contracted in response to changing political, economic, and environmental conditions, though the absence of continuous textual records leaves the scale and nature of these shifts partly speculative. Inscriptions discovered around the oasis, written in various North Arabian scripts and later in Arabic, provide personal names, dedicatory formulas, and brief transactional references rather than extended historical accounts. While valuable, these texts offer only fragmented insights into social organization and authority, without clarifying the broader forces that shaped Dumat al-Jandal's long-term trajectory. Geological studies indicate that the oasis occupies a basin influenced by tectonic activity and sediment redistribution, processes that altered drainage patterns and water channels over time. These changes may have contributed to episodes of reoccupation or spatial reconfiguration within the settlement, though their precise impact remains debated due to uneven preservation. Small finds recovered from excavations, including beads of distant origin, metal objects reflecting mixed technological traditions, and botanical remains indicating shifts in cultivated crops, suggest that Dumat al-Jandal participated intermittently in wider regional networks. Yet these connections appear irregular rather than continuous, producing noticeable gaps where expected material evidence is absent. Deeper excavation levels reveal stone-built structures whose original functions remain uncertain. Some may have served as storage facilities, others as defensive or administrative spaces, but erosion, reuse, and partial collapse have obscured internal layouts, making confident classification difficult. Even Dumat al-Jandal's well-documented role as a frontier town in historical sources does not translate into a cohesive archaeological narrative. The material layers do not consistently align with recorded events, raising questions about the scale and material impact of conflicts, alliances, and exchanges described in later texts. Ongoing geophysical surveys and subsurface mapping point to possible earlier fortification lines, buried water channels, and rectilinear anomalies suggestive of large compounds. Interpretation remains cautious, acknowledging the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the likelihood that some occupational phases were too brief or lightly constructed to leave a durable archaeological imprint. Thus, Dumat al-Jandal endures as a settlement whose prominent monuments anchor its historical identity, while deeper layers reveal a quieter and more ambiguous record of adaptation, resilience, and episodic significance. Its ruins are neither enigmatic nor fully resolved, but instead occupy a space between clarity and absence, inviting sustained inquiry into the movements of people, water, and authority that shaped a town whose long history remains partially veiled beneath the shifting sediments of its ancient oasis. Jubbah rock art. North of the great sandstone escarpments of the Nafud Desert, where ancient lakes once mirrored a greener Arabia and winds now sweep across long ripples in a dry basin, the rock art of Jubbah emerges across towering outcrops and sheltered alcoves as an extensive, weathered archive of human presence stretching back tens of millennia. At first, the carvings appear simply as a scattered assortment of figures, animals, hunters, and geometric marks etched into stone that has undergone long cycles of erosion and deposition. Yet as one begins to trace the layers of petroglyphs across the vertical faces of Jebel Sinman and the surrounding formations, a far more complex narrative emerges than their initial simplicity suggests. Variations in style, technique, and weathering indicate multiple cultural groups visiting or living near the basin during periods when the climate supported grasslands, freshwater, and abundant wildlife, sustaining communities whose other material traces remain sparse. Attempts to situate the earliest carvings within a clear chronological framework rely on superimposition, motif patterning, and comparison with broader Arabian rock art traditions. Yet these methods yield broad ranges rather than precise dates. On the oldest panels, deeply incised figures of large bovids and elongated human forms display weathering patterns consistent with late Pleistocene or early Holocene conditions. Without associated organic material, these carvings remain difficult to date precisely, leaving open questions about the tempo of artistic activity during periods when hippos, gazelles, and other now-rare fauna populated the basin. As time progressed, later carvings introduced camels, equids, and standardized human silhouettes, reflecting adaptation to changing environments and economic practices. These transitions are neither uniform nor simultaneous across the site. Some panels show rapid adoption of new motifs, while others preserve older forms long after local ecological conditions had shifted, demonstrating that stylistic evolution was complex and uneven across the communities interacting with these rocks. Archaeological surveys reveal stone tools, hearth remnants, and ephemeral structures scattered along former lake margins, though their uneven distribution makes correlating specific habitation zones with rock art phases difficult. In many instances, the petroglyphs themselves serve as the most enduring marker of human activity, even in the near absence of other material evidence sufficient to clarify social organization or cultural identity. Geological investigations further complicate interpretation. The sandstone surfaces have undergone exfoliation, mineral streaking, and microfracturing, sometimes obscuring older engravings while accentuating newer ones. Wind erosion can unevenly scour panels, creating the misleading impression that deeper grooves are younger than they actually are. The motifs themselves offer insight while sustaining ambiguity. Depictions of cattle and pastoral scenes suggest herding practices, while hunting scenes with archers and dogs point to subsistence strategies, yet these images cannot consistently be matched with paleo-environmental reconstructions. Some may reflect symbolic or commemorative practices rather than literal documentation of daily life. Sparse inscriptions in early North Arabian scripts appear on select panels, providing limited chronological anchors within the Iron Age and later periods. However, their rarity and placement, even atop older carvings, emphasize recurrent human engagement with these surfaces rather than continuous textual narrative. Panel placement also introduces interpretive questions. Elaborate images occupy high, often inaccessible ledges, suggesting the use of scaffolding or natural ramps now eroded, while other carvings cluster in sheltered alcoves that enhance preservation but limit visibility. This diversity may reflect motives ranging from public display to ritual privacy, or simple practical considerations, none of which can be confirmed archaeologically. The broader paleo-environmental context adds layers of complexity. Core samples indicate that Jubbah's lakes fluctuated dramatically over millennia, at times supporting dense vegetation and abundant wildlife, at others shrinking to marshes or drying entirely. Yet artistic phases do not map neatly onto lake-level reconstructions. Carvings of abundant fauna appear in locations difficult to access during wetter periods, while desert-adapted animals are sometimes depicted on panels likely exposed during earlier greener phases. Such inconsistencies illustrate the challenge of linking rock art directly to environmental conditions. Additional anomalies include figures with unusual proportions, abstract forms unlike regional motifs, and partially erased outlines that could represent unfinished carvings or natural weathering. These do not suggest anything extraordinary but highlight how fragmentary preservation and evolving techniques complicate interpretation, particularly when few associated artifacts exist. Modern photogrammetry and high-resolution scanning reveal faint carvings beneath more prominent motifs, indicating sequences of reuse where later groups inscribed over earlier ones. These acts may signify continuity of presence rather than erasure, though intentions remain speculative. Attempts to assign particular clusters to distinct cultural groups, prehistoric hunter-gatherers, early pastoralists, or oasis-dwelling communities engaging with regional trade networks, remain provisional. While the art provides suggestive clues, the surrounding archaeological record is too fragmentary for firm attribution, and overlapping styles indicate intermittent, rather than continuous, occupation. As shifting dunes advance and reseed around the outcrops, further masking or exposing carved surfaces, researchers recognize that the visible record represents only part of the site's artistic history. Buried panels await discovery, while eroded carvings offer only partial glimpses of their original form. Ultimately, the rock art of Jubbah endures as one of Arabia's most extensive and varied pictorial archives. Its carvings preserve both the clarity of recognizable scenes and the ambiguity of uncertain chronology, reflecting a landscape repeatedly revisited across shifting climates. They leave a layered tapestry inviting reflection on memory, landscape, and time, in a basin where the past remains vivid yet never fully resolved. Harrat Al-Faw graves. South of the windswept approaches to the Wadi Adawasiya Basin, where low escarpments and gravel plains merge into the threshold of the empty quarter, the tombs of Harrat Al-Faw lie dispersed across the desert in subdued clusters of stone and sand. At first glance, these burial structures appear as peripheral remnants of a once prosperous urban center whose commercial and ritual core lay nearby. Yet as one moves deeper into the necropolis, the terrain reveals a far more intricate funerary landscape, its chambers, cairns, and masonry enclosures reflecting mortuary practices that evolved gradually over centuries of occupation. What initially seems like architectural uniformity gives way to subtle complexity as partially eroded walls, collapsed roofs, and shifts in tomb orientation emerge from drifting sands. These variations suggest that the cemetery did not originate from a single, unified plan, but instead developed through episodic construction phases. Excavation of selected tombs reveals stratified deposits of human remains, ceramics, beads, and organic materials. However, these findings do not always correspond neatly with the architectural forms surrounding them, indicating that older tombs were sometimes reused, expanded, or symbolically referenced by later generations adapting inherited burial traditions to changing social needs. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic typology, and fragmentary inscriptions recovered from the necropolis of Harrat Al-Faw point to a prolonged period of use. At times, these chronological indicators challenge expected stylistic sequences. Some structurally elaborate tombs yield earlier dates than simpler neighboring examples. Rather than signaling anomalous cultural behavior, such patterns suggest social diversity, unequal preservation, or reoccupation across generations. Inscriptions discovered within certain chambers, written in ancient South Arabian scripts associated with the Kingdom of Kinda, preserve personal names, dedications, and traces of lineage. Yet these texts remain isolated fragments rather than parts of a continuous narrative, leaving the precise relationship between tomb clusters and the wider urban population of Harrat Al-Faw only partially understood. Geological analysis demonstrates that gradual sediment accumulation and dune migration significantly altered the original topography of the necropolis. Some tombs are now buried almost to their lintels, while others remain fully exposed. This uneven preservation complicates efforts to reconstruct the cemetery's original layout. Structures that now appear isolated may once have formed components of larger funerary complexes connected by low walls or pathways since erased by erosion. Certain tombs were constructed with carefully dressed stone, their entrances framed by slabs that once bore plaster or pigment, while others relied on simpler rubble construction. These differences may reflect variations in social status, available resources, or construction phases, though collapse and later disturbance often obscure the original workmanship. Human remains recovered from the tombs of Harrat Al-Faw reveal diverse burial practices. Some individuals were interred within stone-lined chambers, while others were placed in simpler pits. Attempts to correlate burial form with social hierarchy remain inconclusive. Grave goods range from modest to elaborate, yet they do not form a consistent ranking system, suggesting evolving cultural norms and family-based choices rather than rigid social stratification. Small finds, including shell beads likely obtained through long-distance trade, preserved textile fragments, carved stone lids, and occasional metal ornaments, testify to both regional connections and local craft traditions. Still, the uneven distribution of such items across the necropolis leaves interpretive gaps where expected indicators are absent. Environmental reconstructions indicate that during the peak occupation of Qariyat al-Faw, water resources were more abundant than today. Wells and irrigated fields likely sustained populations extending beyond the urban core. Subsequent climatic shifts that reduced water availability may have influenced both the frequency and style of tomb construction, contributing to the irregular chronological signals observed within the cemetery. Remote sensing surveys have identified faint rectilinear anomalies beneath sand-covered areas, possibly representing additional tombs or boundary walls. Until excavation verifies their nature, the spatial logic of the necropolis remains partially speculative. Within several exposed chambers, soot residues on ceilings suggest that tombs were reopened in antiquity, perhaps for secondary burials, ritual visitation, or maintenance of family burial plots. Mixed deposits further indicate episodes of disturbance that complicate efforts to reconstruct original burial sequences. The connection between the tombs and the broader religious life of Qariyat al-Faw remains difficult to define. While temples and urban inscriptions attest to organized ritual activity, the diversity of funerary forms resists straightforward alignment with a single religious doctrine. Mortuary customs likely blended local traditions, regional influences, and shifting social identities over long periods of use. Geological context adds another layer of complexity. Tombs constructed on firmer bedrock show markedly different preservation from those built in looser sediment, creating misleading contrasts in apparent age or craftsmanship. Archaeologists occasionally encounter anomalies such as unfinished chambers, corridors that terminate abruptly, or stones bearing tool marks inconsistent with nearby construction. These features are best explained by phased construction, material reuse, or repairs carried out using varying techniques, reflecting the incremental and adaptive nature of the necropolis rather than abrupt cultural change. As research continues, the tombs of Qariyat al-Faw provide valuable insight into a society negotiating trade networks, environmental pressures, and internal social dynamics. Yet the evidence remains insufficient to fully reconstruct the evolution of its burial practices. Stylistic shifts and spatial arrangements remain suspended between informed hypothesis and the interpretive limits imposed by erosion and partial excavation. Ultimately, the necropolis stands as a restrained but complex testament to a community whose presence survives in stone chambers and scattered artifacts, offering neither dramatic mystery nor complete resolution, but a quiet, enduring record of material memory shaped by time, landscape, and the gradual fading of an ancient city's story. And as the desert slowly reclaims what remains, these silent structures continue to endure, fragments of lives, beliefs, and choices shaped by time rather than certainty. What we see today is not a single story, but overlapping traces of human presence, preserved unevenly by stone, sand, and memory. If you wish to explore more forgotten landscapes, unresolved histories, and the quiet mysteries buried beneath familiar ground, consider subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications. More stories await, waiting patiently to be uncovered.